Hello, and welcome to Carbonwhy, the channel that's catered to those who are avid lifelong learners. My channel explores the how, what, where, why the world works the way it does. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe button so that you can get notified of my next video. In this week's episode, we find out, will New York City go bankrupt? New York City. If you can't make it there, you can make it anywhere. New York City is no doubt the richest city in the world, with a total wealth of $2.7 trillion, 113 billionaires, and 25,000 people with ultra-high net worth. But the lockdown has rocketed the city. At one point, the fatality rate was about 10% of the city's population, and over 30% were hospitalized. In April 2020, nearly 1 in every 3 New Yorkers were jobless, and total consumer spending was down by over 40%. And the tourism industry took a hard hit too. The industry supported almost 400,000 jobs and generated around $70 billion in 2019. But the lockdown brought that to a screeching halt. And as if that wasn't enough, crimes like shootings and murders skyrocketed. The consequence of the fallout from the lockdown is a potential budget shortfall of at least $30 billion in the next few years. The city will be getting nearly $24 billion in federal aid soon, but officials say that won't be enough. Part of Governor Cuomo's proposal for economic recovery is to raise taxes on the wealthy. But the problem with that is that raised income taxes will make New York the area with the highest state and local income tax in the US. Andrew Cuomo, a candidate for mayor of New York City, also agrees that asking the wealthy to contribute more is appropriate. Another part of Cuomo's proposal is to cut Medicaid and school spending. But cutting public services is a slippery slope to walk on politically, economically, and morally. While high-income areas invite high migration, this will actually lead to people leaving the city. By the end of 2020, about 93,000 more people left the city than moved in. It doesn't sound like much because the city's total population is 8.3 million, but the ones that left took $34 billion in personal income with them. But people like Jared Wolczak, VP of State Projects at the Tax Foundation, don't think this is the end of New York City just yet. But it definitely is a serious challenge that policymakers need to be dealing with. Economists often refer to post-recession recoveries with a letter, L, U, V, or W. That shape of the letters kind of mimics the rise and falls in the economy. V is the ideal letter, meaning the economy fell sharply but will also rise sharply. But the lockdown has introduced a whole new letter to the scene, the K. What's so different about this one is that it means a portion of the economy will recover, like those who were able to save and benefit from the sharp rise in asset values, but this letter also means that a portion of the economy will continue to fall. In 2020, industries like hospitality, entertainment, food service, or travel were completely shut down. 662,000 jobs were lost, and bankruptcies surged by 40%. Unemployment in the city is at 13.1% and even higher for those below the poverty line. Charles Kahn, the organizing director at Strong Economy for All Coalition, says that the state needs to spend money on things like building affordable housing and rebuilding the roads and bridges, because those are the things that's going to put people back to work. Andrew Cuomo, a candidate mayor for New York City, has proposed a $1 billion cash relief for the extremely poor. High-speed internet to the 29% of New York City residents who don't have access to it, and a People's Bank to help reduce the proportion of New Yorkers that are unbanked and underbanked. Looking at the fiscal side of things, the city initially projected a budget drop of $8.33 billion for fiscal year 2021. But a mid-year review in February showed that the projected revenue from income and corporate taxes is looking to generate a surplus of nearly $3.4 billion. As for the medium term, the outlook doesn't look too good. The city is projecting a $15.6 billion deficit for fiscal year 2021 through 2024, mainly due to a decline in property tax collections. And for the entire state of New York, Governor Cuomo estimates a $15 billion deficit just for fiscal year 2022. Yet still, people like Jared Wolczak, VP of State Projects at the Tax Foundation, think the economic decline is still manageable and that policymakers are overreacting to the revenue shortfalls they have right now. He says tax collections were down by only 1% for 2020, which is well within the state's ability to cover, even though expenses keep going up. Regardless, city and state officials are feeling the pressure. There are a number of proposals to deal with the uncertain road ahead, like President Biden's American Rescue Plan that was signed on March 12th, that includes nearly $24 billion to the various levels of the New York government, of which $6 billion will go to New York City. Charles Kahn says that the wealthiest people in the state had their wealth increased by $88 billion. Charles also said the deficit New York City faces is a failure of the city and state policy to tax the wealthy that are gaining the most from the economy and reinvesting it into the rest of the economy. Evidence shows that the wealthy are leaving high-tax cities and states during the lockdown. Their leaving will result in a huge fiscal crisis, and the people who stay will be left with the burden of higher taxes or less government services. So the real question that policymakers are facing is, how do they keep the wealthy in the city? Or will the wealthy even return post-lockdown? In 2018, the 1%ers made up 42.5% of total income tax collected by the city, according to the Independent Budget Office. That was $5 billion in revenue for the city. In January of 2021, Governor Cuomo proposed a top tax rate increase of up to 2 percentage points. Studies have shown that if the state increases taxes by 60 to 70%, there would still be a net positive in revenues despite the flight of millionaires that would leave the city. On top of the state's top tax rate of 8.82%, the city levies its own income tax, which can be as much as 3.876%. The Tax Foundation's calculations place New York as the third most expensive state to live and do business in, and CNBC's ranking of attractiveness for businesses puts the state at 27th. New York City has an exceptionally high municipal income tax, but if people are not physically working there, then the city gets no revenue, meaning that as those Midtown Manhattan offices empty out, so do the city's funds. But income taxes are just one part of the story. Property taxes, on the other hand, New York City depends even more heavily on those. According to a report by the Real Estate Board of New York, investment and residential property sales were down 46% in 2020. That is a €1.6 billion loss in revenue for both the city and state combined. But there's some indication of recovery. January 2021 saw sales worth $6 billion, that's nearly 40% up from January 2020. E.J. McMahon, senior fellow and founder of Empire Center for Public Policy, says that as taxes slump because of low values, the city will simply raise rates to target higher taxes on the remaining landlords and businesses and high-earning individuals in the city to make up for the loss. And that's only going to push people and businesses away and results in more losses. There is a common fear among lawmakers and experts of high-income earners leaving cities or states because of high taxes, and rightfully so. Given what we know about millionaires and billionaires, they're known to avoid taxes. There's a culture of income defense amongst the wealthy, with accountants and lawyers and wealth managers who are helping them reduce their tax burden. Christabel Young, associate professor of psychology at Cornell University, has been analyzing the tax returns of the wealthy for over a decade and found that 2.34% of millionaires change their location every year, and 1 in every 8, which is around 0.3% of that population, move for lower tax rates. But a straight tax increase on the rich is not the only option. The city's Independent Budget Office has proposed a mixture that would both cut costs and raise revenue. New York City has seen some major downturns in its time. There was the 1918 flu pandemic, the Great Depression, 9/11, the 2008 recession, and now the lockdown. And each time was believed to be the fall of the city, and each time they weren't. There was a time when the federal government was willing to invest in its cities. But in the decades after World War II, the idea of the federal government supporting New York City went away. The 1960s saw the working poor thriving in New York City. There was a free public hospital system, free university tuition at City University of New York schools, a large public housing system, cheap and reasonable subway service, and generous salaries for public service workers. But the services weren't exactly cheap, and by 1975, the city was plagued by a fiscal crisis. The city then became a symbol of everything wrong with big government. The president at the time, President Ford, denied federal aid to the people of New York City, and banks forced city officials into an austerity program that cut social services. The city avoided bankruptcy, but historian Kim Phillips-Fein argues that the austerity measures completely transformed the city's politics, character, and demographic forever. Kim Phillips-Fein says that in certain ways the development of the city became more geared towards the idea that city policy had to attract wealthy residents and businesses and do whatever was necessary to keep the wealthy in. So, from 1977 to 1997, the top tax rate on earned income reduced by more than 50%. The state's GDP exploded and the rich got richer while the poor became poorer. And this continues now, even today. Many of the crises that have played out in the city affect people very differently, depending on where they are in the economic structure. In the years following the Great Recession, New York City experienced its strongest expansion in decades. As for this time, even though the economy is in shambles, the state and city's fiscal situation is looking better than previous downturns and not as bad as initially predicted. And the fact that Americans in general have more savings than ever before bodes well for recovery. E.J. McMahon believes that the city could get back to how it was before, if the people got some assurance that the city and state were not going to trample prosperous and profitable businesses with even higher taxes. But for now, there's just a whole lot of uncertainty. Kim Phillips-Fein says public services need to be protected and expanded to deal with the lockdown. She says those are much more important in driving people out and inviting them into New York than tax increases. But what makes the lockdown so different from the other crises to hit New York is the unprecedented uncertainty in both the short term, in terms of the speed of the distribution of vaccines and the arrival of federal aid, and the long term, whether the city can retain its economy. And that is under major risk if work-from-home orders are sustained. New York has always proven to be resilient. And it will continue to, though things might not be exactly the same again. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and watch these videos that might pique your interest. Thank you for your support.